I'd like to thank you, Dr. Rico X, and your students, your undergraduate students, and your graduate students for coming out for this lecture about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his development of practicing nonviolence. The practice of nonviolence is paradoxical to the human nature. Psychologists agree that when the human psyche is faced with bodily harm, our reaction is either fight or flight, and our normal reaction is not to surrender to an attack. Dr. King did not always practice nonviolence. His autobiography reveals that he first developed a progressive intellectual maturity towards nonviolence when he matriculated at Crozat Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania during the late 1940s and early 1950s. He did independent study on Mahatma Gandhi and the nonviolent technique that he used in his homeland of India to free his fellow countrymen and women from British rule in the early 20th century. Martin was fascinated by Gandhi's success in overthrowing the British military without using a single weapon. He had an epiphany that this same nonviolent turn the other cheek method could be used in America to acquire equality for blacks in the segregated South. Martin confessed, prior to reading Gandhi, I had about concluded that the ethics of Jesus were only effective in individual relationships. The turn the other cheek philosophy and the love your enemy philosophy were only valid, I felt, when individuals were in conflict with each other. When racial groups and nations were in conflict, a more realistic approach seemed necessary. But after reading Gandhi, I saw how utterly mistaken I was. 5 to 7 years after this epiphany, Martin found himself the chosen leader of the African American community in Montgomery, Alabama, in a bus boycott on December 5, 1955, after Mrs. Rosa Parks, the Montgomery NAACP secretary, refused to give up her seat on the city bus to a white passenger. He told the followers and the press that the demonstration would be nonviolent. However, when his house was bombed while his wife Coretta and infant child Yolanda were inside, Martin buckled to pressure from some of the African American men, and he allowed armed guards to stand post at his home to protect him and his family from any further attacks by angry segregationists. Furthermore, he went to the Montgomery Sheriff's Office to register for a handgun to carry in his automobile when he traveled through the city alone. The sheriff's office promptly denied him the permit. It wasn't until veteran nonviolent practitioner Bayard Rustin volunteered to meet Martin on February 21st, 1956, that Martin began to surrender unequivocally to the practice of nonviolence. It was clear to Bayard that Martin had an intellectual understanding of nonviolence, but not an unconditional commitment to it. Bayard explained to him that in order to gain the high moral ground in nonviolence, you must not demonstrate a willingness to return violence for violence, even if it costs you life or liberty. This, he explained to Martin, was the power of nonviolence. It disarms the attacker's desire to continue inflicting pain on the nonviolent demonstrators because they do not fuel the desire in the attacker to defend himself. And if you lose liberty, it shifts the public of opinion and sympathy towards the nonviolent protesters. Thus, the purpose is to force the ruling class to surrender power voluntarily or through government force. It wasn't until Martin accepted nonviolence without any mental reservation that he was able to win the bus boycott demonstration and get the civil rights bill and the Voters' Rights Act bill passed in Congress because even the worst segregationists could not get enough public support to continue beating, jailing, and killing unarmed citizens who were seeking equal treatment under the law by exerting their First Amendment rights.
Well, I just want to say I thought it was interesting that on February 21st, you said 1956, that King adopts this nonviolence when
Unconditionally, yes.
unconditionally, and February 21st, 1965, we lost Malcolm.
This is because Malcolm had made a transition himself from the talking of violence to that of coexistence among both black and whites and all Americans, and so the by any means necessary was no longer his motto. Anybody else?
What was the relationship on that note between Malcolm and Martin?
Well, there was a great deal of respect from both men for each other, even though people try to paint them as enemies. They were not enemies. They highly regarded each other as intelligent men who wanted to gain equality for their people. It's just that they had two different methods of going about it, and it oftentimes caused them to not come together. And that's so sad, because Malcolm was turning at the end, and he even reached out to Dr. King's wife, and they spoke at length, and he wanted Martin to join him, and he wanted to join Martin. He had even apologized for a lot of the negative things he said about Martin and about white people. So yeah, it's a very unfortunate thing, but they definitely respected each other.
So I always thought that Dr. King practiced nonviolent purity. I was not aware that what you said about him. I wasn't aware.
Yes, Dr. King did not always practice what is known as nonviolence. As a matter of fact, from a little small child is when he first developed hatred towards white people. He was about 6 years old. He had a little white friend whose father owned the community grocery store, and he would play baseball with him. Martin was good at baseball, so he would play baseball with this little young white boy, and he had a lot of affection for him. And the white boy's father forbade him to play with Martin because he was black. And Martin, in his autobiography, said, "How can I love a race of people that hate me so much?" And there was another situation where he entered a oratorical contest in Dublin, Georgia, 90 miles from his home in Atlanta, Georgia. He won the contest, and his favorite teacher, Miss Bradley, escorted him there and escorted him back. And on the way back, the white bus driver told him to give up his seat to the white passenger, and Martin refused to give up his seat. He was willing to fight and not give up his seat, but Miss Bradley pleaded with him to give up his seat. And he stated at that time, that was the angriest that I had ever been.
I think it's interesting, the whole nonviolence movement. And I see it more so as a sense of strength, because it does take a bigger person to walk away.
It does.
And it takes two people to argue. And I think that as a community, we've adopted that very well when it comes to the oppressor.
Yes.
And I think now we need nonviolence amongst each other in our own community and dealing with one another. And so I'm interested, like, how do you think Martin perhaps would go about trying to teach nonviolence to a group of people when they are they're violent with each other? So like we need that whole nonviolence movement again, but now the oppressor looks like me.
Right. And that's what I do when I go to the inner city schools. I teach the nonviolent conflict resolution. And if Martin was alive today, as you know, he matured as well on his stance as far as how to deal with the situations of the races and all of that. and he had began to teach black people that even though we protest for rights and we would gain certain rights, that the majority could still take those rights from us. So we had to develop a system of maintaining our rights. And he talked about economic empowerment among black people, where he talked about black people getting a certain amount of government contracts, black people getting a certain amount of jobs, and black people strengthening their own black banks and gaining power. So today, with the height of the violence among especially young African-American males who kill each other alarmingly, Martin would be teaching nonviolence in these public schools where young black children go, where there's a lot of violence and shooting and killing, and in these communities like Compton and places like that, and teaching nonviolence among ourselves. And we must begin to learn that. That's the first step that we must take.
How long do you think this is going to last, as far as being inked out, being so caught up in just mistreatment that will keep you down because of what you've done? How long do you think it'll last?
Well, hopefully it doesn't last long, but King once said when he was in Selma in his speech, how long, not long, because no lie can live forever. How long, not long, because the mark of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But we hope that it's not long. But this time around, it is not the responsibility or the problem of the white people per se. It is now the responsibility of us who have gained degrees and skills and abilities and can teach our people. And it's the responsibility of the churches to come together and not be individualistic. It's the responsibility of the people with PhDs and master's degrees not to be individualistic, but to come together on a common goal. It is the responsibility of the entire religious community, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, and all of that black people worship, to come together on one common goal, and that is bringing us back to a culture, because we were a culture of people prior to coming to America, and that culture was destroyed. But Bob Marley said it better than anybody can say it. No one frees us but ourselves. So we got to free ourselves. Now the responsibility is on us. How many people are we willing to gather up and make a difference in our lives?
That makes it hard. I mean, because I still see things myself. Nonetheless, what's the delay, in your opinion?
Well, the delay is that we are still divided, unfortunately. We're still divided. We still even deal with the issue of women in the pulpit and all that kind of stuff, right? Which is something ridiculous. Because my God, a woman is a human being just like a man. She has a brain just like a man, and God used women and all that kind of stuff. So, there's a lot of divisions that we need to get rid of. And that's why I go about the city and different places trying to break down those divisions. I talk to ministers. I talk to different civil rights organizations. I talk to different colleges. I talk to different activists, by saying, look, let's lay down the difference that we have, and let's look at what we have in common and go from there. And we deal with the differences later on, because we have to deal with what we have in common right now, because our culture is dying. If we do not step up, we will be a permanent underclass. Black people are becoming a permanent underclass, coming straight from the womb. They're becoming a permanent underclass. They determine how many jails to build, how many prisons to build, based on the grades that little children make while they're in elementary school, and their reading level. Yes, they sure do.
All right, thank you.